Hola, hello, and welcome to Spiritcraft, the podcast to nurture your soul and unleash the magic within. I'm Marta, your host, and this week I have an episode on one of my favorite topics, Ancestor Veneration. Before we get into today's topic, I want to let you know that even though many platforms where you listen have automatic transcriptions, I always add accurate transcriptions to my website. You can find the link in each episode's show notes. The reason I do this is that many times, because of my accent, the automatic transcriptions aren't correct. I guess it's the perks of podcasting in your second language. So if you ever want to catch up on an episode or want to check a journaling prompt or something else, you can find them all on the website. And by the way, I hope you took a wellness check there, because I haven't forgotten about the game I mentioned in the last episode. Remember, if I mention journaling, you have to take that as a prompt to drink some water, take a mindfulness break, do some deep breathing, whatever you need at that moment. Okay, there's a good chance that this will be a two-part episode because it's a topic that I really love and I could talk about this for days. So you've been warned. In today's episode, we're going to explore ancestral veneration, what it is and why it's important. I'll briefly touch on different cultures, but much of what I'll talk about will be based on my own practice. And after that, I'll explain how to set up an ancestor altar and I'll share some simple rituals to honor your ancestors. Talking about ancestral connection might sound a bit strange on paper, but many people already practice ancestral veneration in their regular lives. Our connection with our ancestral roots help us feel grounded and give us a sense of belonging. And many people all over the world cultivate this relationship. In addition, we turn to our ancestors for guidance and protection. We ask them to look over us or other family members and turn to them in moments of crisis. Now, I want to clarify what I mean when I talk about ancestors. By ancestor, I mean those from whom we are descended, such as our grandparents or great-grandparents, and yes, even prehistoric ancestors. This would be the more widespread use of the word. I will also include here other beings that have influenced us and inspired and guide us. This can be spiritual ancestors or other chosen figures. Spiritual ancestors are those who influence our spiritual beliefs or practices regardless of personal connection. They can be religious leaders, cultural icons, or even mythological beings. For example, Buddha might be seen as an spiritual ancestor for someone who practices Buddhism. Chosen figures are individuals that someone actively selects as role models based on their personal values or aspirations. For example, someone might choose Marie Curie as a chosen figure, admiring her pioneering work in science and her dedication to advancing women's roles in STEM. They might draw inspiration from her perseverance and contributions to knowledge. Finally, you can also include ancestors of the land, especially important if you live somewhere you're not from, like me, or if the land you inhabit was colonized at some point. Many cultures around the world have strong ancestor veneration traditions, where honoring those who came before us is an integral part of their spiritual and cultural practices. In Chinese culture, ancestor worship is a long-standing practice that involves rituals, offerings, and festivals like Qingming, which means Tomb Sweeping Day. Families visit the graves of their ancestors to clean their tombstones and make offerings, showing respect and maintaining family bonds. In Japan, ancestor veneration is central to Shinto and Buddhism. The festival of Obon is a significant time when families welcome the spirits of their ancestors back home. People visit graves, make offerings, and hold ceremonies to honor the spirits. Across Africa, ancestor veneration is a crucial part of many spiritual practices. For example, in Yoruba culture in Nigeria, ancestors, known as Egungun, are believed to have the power to influence the living, and special rituals are conducted to honor them. In Zulu and Xhosa traditions in South Africa, ancestors are seen as intermediaries between the living and the divine, and regular offerings are made to maintain their favor and their protection. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, is a well-known tradition that combines indigenous practices with Catholic influences to honor deceased loved ones. Families create altars, which are called ofrendas. They decorate them with marigolds and make offerings of food, drinks, and personal items to invite the spirits back for a visit. In fact, many indigenous peoples of North and South America have rich traditions of ancestor veneration, viewing ancestors as important guides and protectors. Rituals might involve storytelling, offerings, or dances to keep the ancestral connection alive. In Hinduism, the ritual of Shraddha is performed to honor deceased relatives and ensure their peace in the afterlife. In Korea, the practice of Jesa is performed to honor deceased family members. These rituals typically take place on the anniversary of an ancestor's death, with families preparing food offerings and performing specific rites to maintain the ancestral connection. Ancestor worship in Vietnam is a significant tradition, with families maintaining altars in their homes where they make regular offerings and prayers to honor their ancestors. Filial piety and respect for elders are emphasized. In many Polynesian cultures, including those in Hawaii, Samoa, and Fiji, ancestors are revered, and their guidance is sought in important life events. The concept of mana, which is a spiritual power, often includes respect for ancestral spirits who are believed to influence the well-being of the living. Samhain, for example, is now celebrated all over the world by witches and pagans, and it started in Ireland and Scotland. It marks the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, and it is believed that during this time, ancestors are able to communicate more easily. People set up altars, light candles, and offer food to honor their deceased relatives. In Spain, rituals to honor ancestors are deeply rooted in the culture. For example, during All Saints' Day celebration, families visit graves and offer food, flowers, and prayers for the deceased. On the 2nd of November, All Souls' Day is a time for Christians to pray for and remember the souls of the deceased. So in countries like Italy, France, Poland, families visit cemeteries, they light candles, and bring flowers to the graves of their loved ones as acts of veneration. In parts of Central and Northern Europe, Walpurgis Night involves celebrating the transition from winter to summer, and it's also a time when people remember their ancestors. In some traditions, bonfires are lit to ward off evil spirits and honor the dead. In some Slavic cultures, there are ongoing traditions of ancestor veneration, such as in Poland and Russia. These traditions include setting up altars and performing rituals during significant festivals like Kupala Night, where people might honor their ancestors through offerings or rituals connected to water and fertility. In Finland, Muistojuhla, which is a memory festival, is celebrated, where people honor their deceased family members, particularly during the first weekend of November. Families visit cemeteries, light candles, and reflect on the lives of their ancestors. As you can see, these diverse cultural practices show how much ancestor veneration remains a powerful tradition across different societies, and each of them, they're adding their own unique interpretations and rituals to honor and connect with the past. Okay, so before I go into my next section, which is setting up an ancestor altar, I want to make it clear that you do not need to have an altar in order to work or simply connect with your ancestors. I could simply tell you to remember them and speak to them and call it a day. But if you want to keep that connection alive and even receive guidance from them, just keep listening. Creating an ancestor altar doesn't have to be complicated anyway. You can simply place pictures of your ancestors somewhere, like, for example, on a shelf. At its simplest, you just need a clean surface and some photographs. You could even have a wall in your home with picture frames of all of your ancestors, and that could be a place where you stop by and spend some minutes with them. You might also want to look at the post I wrote about setting up an altar and sacred spaces, as it will have other ideas too. And as usual, I will add the links in the show notes. Now, some traditions have very specific rules about how to create ancestor altars and who can or cannot be included in them. So if you follow a specific tradition or religion, check with your elders or leaders and make sure that you do it the way you're supposed to. But if that's not the case, then just go for whatever feels right. And you will hear me say that quite a lot during today's episode. However, when creating an ancestor altar or any altar where you'll be working with spirits in general, it's important to consider its location. Spirits can be very active and noisy at times, so you probably want to avoid placing an altar in the room where you sleep. Some people just cover the altar with a cloth at night, so again, see what works for you. I will also avoid placing the altar in places where I wouldn't necessarily want to place my nan, For example, in the bathroom next to the toilet. It just feels weird and disrespectful to me, and I wouldn't want my ancestors watching me while I need the toilet. It's important to think about the space you have available and what sort of offerings you're going to give, as well as the type of practice that you want to have. For example, if you're going to be offering food, make sure that your pets cannot get to the altar because they will try to eat the offering. And they might make a mess and break things trying to get food. They might burn themselves with the candles. And I learned this the hard way with my first ancestor altar and my beagle dog. He broke a few things a couple of times. And so I stopped offering my ancestors any food for a very long time. In a similar way, if you're going to use candles or incense, I would consider placing the altar away from any smoke detectors. You might hear or read that your ancestor altar should be facing the west because this is the direction associated with death and the spirit realm. And if you have the space to do so, then go ahead. But if not, just use whatever space you have available. It's not going to make a massive difference. From how I understand it, by the way, facing west means that when you are facing your altar, you are looking towards the west. So just double check, because it's one of those things that nobody really explains, and that is essentially how I interpret those instructions. So what would be the best place, in my opinion, to set up your ancestor altar? To me, it would be either the kitchen or the living room. Those two rooms tend to be the heart of every home, and they're where life happens. So your ancestor will be included in your daily life. My ancestor altar is actually in the living room and is near my dining table. So this way, I see it every day as I walk past it several times per day. This allows me to stop by and say hi briefly, to think about them, and generally keep them present, even when I'm busy. I would say the key thing that you need in your ancestor altar is a representation of your ancestors. As I mentioned earlier, ancestors can be anyone who has had an influence in your life, anyone who you consider an ancestor or an elder. It can be a leader in your profession, it can be a cultural icon, or a famous person that you have a connection with. It could also be a friend with whom you had a strong connection. However, bear in mind that in some African traditions, you only place blood relatives on your ancestor altar. So once again, most of the information that I'm going to be sharing comes from my own experience and practice. So take what resonates and discard the rest. But whoever you decide to include, photographs are a great representation method. Even their names written on paper could work. Handwritten letters, mementos, anything that you can think of that reminds you of them. Personally, I have photographs of my deceased grandparents and great-grandparents. I also have a smoking pipe from my granddad on my mom's side, and I have a makeup powder case from my grandma on my dad's side. And I also have a couple of pearl necklaces, which I don't know if they're real or fake. It's just things that remind me of them. Ideally, every altar should have a representation of all four elements for balance, and an ancestor altar is no different. Water, for example, is closely related to death and the afterlife, as well as emotions, at least in tarot. Water is also a cooling element, so it's a great addition for your ancestor altar. Now, if you place a cup of water, don't forget to change it regularly, because you don't want to be offering stale water to your ancestors. You wouldn't even have to place anything else. So that's how valuable and important water is. It could be just your main element. However, fire is very important as well. I don't know if it's the fire itself or the light it creates, but your ancestors will enjoy having candles on their altar. Sometimes if you only have one candle or it's a very small candle, you might get the message that they need more light. And it actually happened to me when I started my ancestor veneration practice. I had some candle, I think it was a votive candle, and it didn't put out much light. And I just got this feeling of them saying more light, more fire. So now I have a couple of candles and they seem quite happy with that. You can also place some earth on your altar, because after all, earth is where our ancestors usually rest. And that would be a very nice way as well to connect with the land, either your homeland or the place where you live. Finally, the way I represent air in my altars is by using feathers and some scent, such as perfume or incense. Air usually represents communication and often the spirit realm. By using scent, I also engage my sense of smell, which is strongly linked to memory, and it deepens my connection with my ancestors. Okay, so we have some representations of our ancestors. We have some elements for balancing the energy. Everything I've read about ancestor altars mentions covering the surface with a cloth. It seems it can be very disrespectful to place the photographs and items on the bare wooden shelf or whatever surface you're using. Now, whether you believe that to be the case or not, it's probably up to you and your ancestors, but it wouldn't hurt to be extra polite and create a really nice place for them. On my altar, I actually have a few crochet doilies and spreads. Some of them were made by me, and some were made by my ancestors. And I think it's a nice way of connecting to them and strengthening that link between us. It might be because in Spain, we always bring flowers to the cemetery when we visit the graves of our relatives. But whenever I think about ancestors, I think about flowers. To me, there cannot be an ancestor altar without flowers. So I'm including them here as an item for the altar rather than just as an offering. Fresh flowers are a great touch, but if you're going to forget about them and leave them to rot, maybe get a nice bunch of pretty dried flowers or even fake ones, and you can use fresh flowers as an offering at certain times. And then finally, you can also place other items on your ancestor altar, such as acorns, feathers, animal bones, shells. Try to find symbols that represent ancestry, roots, strength, wisdom, and so on. I think it's important to find your own connection to different items. For example, I use a vase that belonged to my grandmother, and it looks like a traditional ceramic vase from Spain, so it also connects me to my homeland. Once you have an idea of what you want to do, it's important to cleanse the space and set a positive intention. When putting up the altar, ensure the energy surrounding the activity is the type of energy that you want to invite into the space. For many of us, remembering past relatives can be painful, and so it can be very easy to feel sad or nostalgic at this time. Try to remember the good moments, maybe play some of their favorite music or tell their favorite jokes so they feel welcome and the space feels safe. Then you can state your intention for the altar, such as, I invite the spirits of my ancestors to join me in this sacred space. May this altar serve as a bridge between our worlds. I honor your presence, treasure our connection, and seek your support as I walk my path. And of course, you can come up with your own words if those don't resonate with you. One of the times I set up my ancestor altar, I did so to the sound of achotis, which is a type of music typical from Madrid, which is where I'm from. And it just made me feel very connected to them. There are some kind of commonly observed rules for setting up and maintaining an ancestor altar, such as treating the altar as a sacred space. You have to show reverence through care and intention. Treat it with respect. You should also keep the area tidy and free from clutter. Just ensure that it's a welcoming space for ancestral spirits. In terms of placement, as we said earlier, avoid spaces like bathrooms or areas with high traffic. Choose a quiet, respectful location for the altar. You should provide fresh offerings regularly, such as food, flowers, or water, and remove old offerings before they rot or get stale. You should also do regular maintenance on your altar. Update or refresh the altar periodically to reflect your current intentions and the relationships with your ancestors. The main point of creating an altar is to have a focal point where you can spend time connecting with your ancestors. This should be treated as a sacred space, and it should be treated with respect and reverence. While ancestors are not gods as such, they can be if they're spiritual ancestors, but in this case, I mean blood relatives. They are those who came before us, and they lived their lives through happiness and sadness, through struggles, achievements, and everything in between, so we could be here, right now. It's important to acknowledge the significance of their lives, recognizing the depth of their experiences and the legacy they've left behind, as they contribute to our own paths and growth today. There are some simple rituals that you can perform to honor your ancestors. Candles can represent a guiding light, illuminating their presence and inviting their spirit to join in connection. The flame can also symbolize warmth, life, and protection. It offers comfort to the deceased while creating a sacred space for communication. You can present meals or beverages that your ancestors enjoyed as a form of remembrance and connection. When you cook, you can either set an extra place at the table and serve their meal as you would for a living guest, or you could save a serving to place at the altar. Traditionally, food offerings are left overnight at least and always removed before the food starts to spoil. When offering drinks, however, be mindful, because if you had ancestors who were against alcohol or had any issues with alcohol or substance abuse, you might not want to offer any alcohol or anything like that. Another thing you can do is meditation or reflection. You can spend time in quiet contemplation to strengthen that connection and listen for messages. You can also celebrate specific times of the year at your ancestor altar, like Samhain or Dia de los Muertos. And you can have special ceremonies and offerings at those dates. Creating a memory ritual can be a beautiful way of connecting with your ancestors. Share stories about your ancestors with family or friends, keeping their memory alive. You can also use symbolic items. I like to give offerings that, because of their nature, they become permanent features at my ancestor altar. For example, I have a crow's feather in there because crows are strongly linked to the spirit world, and an acorn because oaks remind me of the spirit world as well. Scent is also very important to me when honoring my ancestors. I have different ways of adding scent to my altar. And of course, you can use incense, herbs, or essential oils that remind you of them. But think as well of the perfume they wore or the aftershave. I also use wax melts with scents like gardenia, jasmine, tobacco, wood, frankincense, you name it. You might not think of this as an offering, but music, words, songs, all of these can be offerings to your ancestors. You can use your words to communicate with your ancestors, asking for guidance or setting your thoughts. You can pray for them. If your great-grandmother loved to sing, maybe sing to her. Or if one of your uncles used to play the guitar, you don't have to play if you're not good at it, but you could play guitar songs on your phone. Just think of whatever they would like to receive. One of my favorite rituals is to enjoy a snack with them. I usually see it as spending family time. First, I light a pillar candle, which is a permanent feature in the altar. And this is a way of signaling to my ancestors that, we're open for business officially. I will then use incense to cleanse the space. If it's an important date, actually, I will clean and refresh any offerings before I light the candle. If it's a regular catch-up, I might do it while the candle is already lit, because after all, I'm sure my great-grandmothers and farther beyond will enjoy keeping me company while I busy myself with making the space nice. Afterwards, I will prepare a small plate with some food. Usually it includes bread, maybe some cheese or anything else, and then I pour myself a drink. It can be water or it can be wine or some other drink traditionally drunk in Spain. I will then get their plate and their glass, and I put a small portion of food and a bit of the same drink and place those at the altar. Then I grab a chair and just sit down and talk to them while eating and drinking, the same way as we would have done in person. I tell them about my day, my dreams, my worries, and so on. After this, it's time to hear back from them. If I need guidance on a topic, I will ask them, or I might make my petition. If there's nothing pressing that I need to know, I will just ask for a message or to hear from them and just sit in silence and wait. Now, I've never had a conversation like you and I might have. To me, it doesn't work like that. However, sometimes I get words out of nowhere in my mind or feelings. Once I asked for a sign and a light bulb just blew right away. And, it all depends. You will feel when it's a message. As you can see, there are many ways of creating an ancestor altar. As usual, the possibilities are endless. So I hope you feel inspired to create your own sacred space. Whether you follow specific guidelines or go with what feels right for you, just remember that ancestor work is deeply personal, so there's no really wrong way to connect. I want to stress it again, that it's important to see what resonates with you and what your ancestors might have enjoyed. You can even ask them what they would like. Remember, though, that you don't have to agree to whatever they suggest. You have your final say after all. Before we finish, I would like to invite you to submit any questions you might have about working with ancestors. This is the chance to ask everything you've always wanted to know. Unless you specify it, I won't share your name or any other details, so you can rest assured that nobody needs to know it's you that is asking the question. I would also love to hear your stories and experiences when doing ancestor work. Honestly, tell me your stories because I love this topic so much. And it makes me happy to hear how other people connect with their ancestors and hear about their practices. Right, I'm going to try to get an episode out next week, but remember that this month I'm living in chaos, so I might not be able to. But whatever it airs, on the next episode, we will go even deeper into ancestral veneration. We will talk about how to integrate ancestral work into your daily routine, and I'll share bits of my own practice. I will also address some common challenges in ancestral work, but don't worry, I will also provide tips to navigate them. I will never leave you hanging. Then I'll share some tools and exercises to deepen your ancestral connection. Okay, talking so much about ancestors has made me really want to sit at my ancestor altar for a bit. So I think that's what I'm going to do now, have a bit of a catch-up. As we close today's episode, I encourage you to take time this week to connect with your ancestors, as it can be a beautiful experience that may enrich your life. Set up your altar, light a candle, or simply spend a few quiet moments in reflection. Remember, your ancestors are there to guide and support you. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you could share it with a friend, leave a review, or connect with me on social media. Because your support means the world to me, and it helps others discover the podcast too. You can also visit the website for more resources and, of course, transcriptions of every episode. And finally, don't forget, next time we will dive deeper into daily ancestor work and overcoming common challenges. But until then, may your connections be strong.